Welcome to Block 43 of our Celebrating the States Block the Month. This is our version of the Texas Star Block. For this block, you will need 3 fabrics, a light, a medium, and a dark. From a 2.5-inch strip of the dark fabric, cut 8 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. From a 2-inch wide strip of the dark fabric, cut 4 rectangles that are 2 inches by 3 inches and 4 rectangles that are 2 inches by 4.5 inches. From a 2.5-inch strip of the medium fabric, cut 8 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From a 4.5-inch strip of the light fabric, cut 1 square that's 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Trim the rest of the strip down to 3 inches and then cut 4 squares that are 3 inches by 3 inches. From a 2.5-inch strip of the light fabric, cut 8 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Once everything is cut, it's time to sew. Please use 1/4-inch seam allowances. With the right sides together, piece the dark 2-inch by 3-inch rectangles to the 3-inch light squares. Press towards the dark fabric. Next, we're going to add the 2-inch by 4.5-inch dark rectangles. Piece 2 that have the dark rectangle on the right side, and then piece 2 that have the dark rectangle on the left side. I wanted to do a quick shout out thank you to all of you who have joined our Facebook group called The Quilted Forest Friends. I love it when you post your blocks on there and show us how you're doing on your blocks. If this is the first state block you've seen, please check the description below. We'll leave a link that will take you to the playlist for all the blocks in our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. Press towards the dark fabric. We now have the 4 corners of the block finished. The corner units should measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Next, we're going to work on the star point sections. Split the 8 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch dark rectangles into 2 piles of 4. With the right sides together, place a light square on one end of the dark rectangle. Sew corner to corner on the light square. You can draw a line corner to corner to have a line to follow, or you can use diagonal seam tape. I got halfway through that first seam when I realized my diagonal seam tape was missing, so I took the time to put it on the machine so that it would be ready for the next one. You can either trim the seam to a 1/4 inch and throw away the spare triangles, or you can sew another seam 1/2 inch away from the first seam to cut in between the 2 sewn lines to have spare 1/2 square triangle units that you can use in another block. We're going to do the same technique with the other 4 dark rectangles and 4 light squares, but we're going to go the opposite direction. So this will go the opposite direction that you did the first set. If you haven't cut the seams yet, now's the time to cut the seams to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then it's time to press. For my block, I pressed all the seams towards the triangles. I would also recommend pressing the seams open. When you go to put the star point blocks together, it would make it a little bit easier to match everything. Take some time to press the spare 1/2 square triangle units also. Using the same technique, we're going to add the medium squares onto the other end of the blue rectangles. When sewing corner to corner on these, you want to match the angle of the first light seam. The dark fabric should end up a parallelogram, not a triangle. Either trim the seam to a 1/4 inch or sew the extra line of stitching and cut in between the lines to get your spare half square triangle blocks. You can press towards a triangle point or you can press the seam open. Sew the 2 rectangles together to make the star point section. The dark fabric should make an arrow shape. For this part, I did press the seam open to reduce bulk. I used a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press spray to help things lay nice and flat. This new lemon mist scent is quickly becoming my favorite. Once pressed, the star point units should measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Now we have all the pieces we need to make the 3 rows to make the block. The 4 corner pieces should mirror each other, with the dark fabric being on the inside. The 4.5 inch light square goes in the center. The 4 star point units should all have the medium fabric touching the center square. Sew the 3 rows together, making sure you double check that you have the pieces turned the correct way. The top and bottom rows should look exactly the same. Press away from the star point units for each of the rows. Only 2 seams left and our Texas block is done. Sew the 3 rows together, double checking as you go that you're sewing the right pieces on the right sides. When sewing the rows together, there's only 2 seams to match up, and those seams should nest together. For the final pressing, I recommend using a little bit of Mary Ellen's Best Press spray to make sure everything lays flat, and you are going to press towards the center row. Once pressed, this block should measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. When I press a block from the back side, I will usually flip it around to the front to make sure I haven't pressed any creases into the quilt block. And with that, our Texas block is done. We hope that you will give us a thumbs up, leave a comment for us to tell us how you're doing on your state blocks, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!